Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of I Played, the unscripted, spoiler-free series where I talk about games that I recently completed. And as a completionist, yep, that means 100%ing. The game on the docket for today is Deathloop, which is made by Arcane Studios of Dishonored fame, so obviously Dishonored 1 and 2, and then also Prey, if you're familiar with that game as well. The game in total, according to How Long to Beat, is estimated around 20 hours for normal, 30 hours for completionist. I ended up playing for around 35 hours, so kept within tradition of slightly going over the completionist time to try to wrap up everything. But yeah, excited to talk about this game because I had a lot of mixed feelings. In terms of the categories that I want to cover in today's video, one of them is just a game overview to give you a heads up of sort of my experience. I also want to talk a little bit about the level design, the story, the systems, the combat, and finally wrap up with some of the technical aspects, which were unfortunately not so great in my experience. But yeah, let's hop into it. Alrighty, so first up I want to sort of give an overview of the experience of the game, because my opinion of the game changed pretty dramatically, to be honest, depending on where I was at in the actual playthrough itself. The general categories were like how I think about the different experiences was the early game, mid game, late game, and post game, as well as sort of the PvP on the side. I'm not going to focus too much on the PvP because I'm mostly interested in the actual single player aspects of the game since I tend to be a single player gamer. But yeah, I want to sort of talk about the different aspects of the game. So first up is the early game, which it is not smooth for players, to be honest. Very, very information heavy. It took me about 5 hours as well. And it's just one of those tutorials that felt like a tutorial the whole time I was playing. It's very rare these days that I feel like a game actually feels like it has a tutorial section, or like if it is, it's only, I don't know, 10 minutes. But this one, like I said, was 5 hours. And the way they do it is they sort of give you a snippet of the sort of like game itself, sort of like a slice of what to expect. But it's very handholdy. And I don't think it's like super narratively compelling. Like the world of Deathloop narratively is just very dense. And I think it just leads to, and it's very systems heavy as well. And so it just sort of leads to like a really rough onboarding for the player where they're not necessarily experiencing the fun and also at the same time not really being sold to very effectively the like why this is going to be fun later on, because it's just like such a rough hill to climb in terms of getting on board with what the game has to offer, both narratively and mechanically. So it wasn't a great start. Now, if you get over that, the problem is the mid-game actually isn't any better. The mid-game lasted me about 10 hours total, and I just don't think it's a good representation of what makes the game fun. And I'll get into that later, because like so far, if you're hearing this, you're probably like, wait, so is this game just straight up bad? Which for most of the game, I actually think it is. However, in the end game, it really ramps up. But the reason why the mid-game itself isn't fun is because basically once you get out of the tutorial, and the tutorial gives you sort of a glimpse of like some of the stuff you'll be able to get later on, you start out very weak, right? You don't have any abilities, you don't have any guns, you're totally fresh. There's a mechanic in the game called infusion that allows you to keep stuff across the course of runs, and it basically means that there's a very steep actual progression curve where you start out with nothing, and then literally just by playing the game more and more, you're able to infuse more things, and then overall end up like much stronger with everything unlocked, and then you don't have to ever really pick anything up because you find stuff that you like to use, whereas at the beginning you just have nothing. And so it totally disempowers the player. It means that also one of the main mechanical features of the game, which is like just straight up combat, really isn't an option because you're so weak. You don't have any passive perks to boost your health. You don't have a lot of movement mechanics, and your guns are pretty weak. They're low quality. And so it just means that basically you're going to get through it with stealth. Now, the game difficulty is sort of accounts for that in terms of the earlier levels being easier, or the earlier portion of the game being easier. But honestly, it's just not that fun. Like, it just sort of feels like you can't really match up against any of the enemies, so it's a total drag. But on the other side of that, the late game and post game are where this game shines. It was kind of tough to stick it out, if I'm being honest. I ended up streaming the game, and if I wasn't streaming it, I think it would have been really hard to force myself to keep playing, because it wasn't really a game I wanted to go back to. And this is like 15 hours in the game, keep in mind. But once you actually get over that hoop of being able to infuse powerful weapons, get like some cool movement abilities down, particularly the shift, which is the short range teleport ability, get more health, passives, stuff like that, then the game becomes really fun. Now, the problem with the late game, which lasted about 5 hours, is that it's like so short. Like by the time you actually get everything you want, the game's basically over. And so, I mean, obviously the core problem here is that the majority of the game just isn't actually fun to play, which is a shame because mechanically, like in terms of game feel, when you're overpowered as fuck, it's such a cool power fantasy. Like being able to just zoom at light speed across the map, sprinting everywhere. The guns feel great to use, both the snipers and the short range and the medium range guns all feel amazing. The powers just allow so much like mechanical mastery over movement specifically, which is really refreshing. Like it's almost like a Mirror's Edge light style of game, which is like super awesome. It's honestly, I can't really think of many games that have that sort of like first person level of just movement being like such a highlight. This game totally manages to capture that. And then this goes the same for the post game. So I ended up playing 10 extra hours after I had officially like gotten the conclusion of the story, meaning there was really no narrative content there for me, but it was just because like I wanted to, you know, I'm a completionist and wanted to like hunt down all the little secrets and things that I may have missed, the side content. But it's also just really fun. Like the reason, you know, normally when I get to a game's end, I'm like, hey, do I really want to wrap everything up? Do I really want to go the extra mile to finish everything off? And I did. I was like, I will take anything that the game can give me at this point, because honestly, at its best, it's like better than Dishonored. It's better than Prey, just because of the actual like mastery that you build up, but then also just like the actual power that you get through better items, through better powers, through better passives. And that fantasy is like really fun. They nail that. It's by far the best part of the game. So that's sort of like experientially the overview of the game. Obviously you can see a lot of the problems with that because it just takes so long to get there. But yeah, that's sort of, I think, the core problem and best parts of Deathloop, right? It's like a double-edged sword where they decided that basically they wanted the player to go through this experience of like being disempowered and trying to build up sort of where they were, like build up their power over the course of the game as sort of like the enemies get tougher, right? So it's like sort of a parallel difficulty curve. So like, you know, the actual difficulty of what you have to do is met by your tools to be able to have like deal with them. But the problem is like the actual like even difficulty just isn't that fun. Like the pacing, and I struggled with this in Dishonored too. The pacing is just really slowed down when you have to be like really cautious, really stealthy. It's pretty forgiving because you can die multiple times without having to like reset all your progress. And obviously it's like a roguelike-esque game, so you don't have to worry too much about, you know, like permanent consequences, because there are some like meta aspects, like I said, through the infusion system that allow you to keep upgrades and stuff like that. But it's just one of those things where it's like the game doesn't really become fun until it lets you run loose, and by that point it's almost too late, which is a shame. Alrighty, so the last section that I want to talk about in the game overview, just real quick, is the PvP section. I didn't try very much of it, around 5 hours total. The PvP system is very similar to Dark Souls, if you're familiar with that, where basically an individual player can invade your world and sort of cause chaos. It's an opt-in system, so if you don't like it, you can just turn it off. But if you're the PvE player, then that means that, yeah, basically you can sort of spice things up by having some other player or a friend invade your world and do some dueling. And theoretically, I don't have a problem with this. I actually enjoyed the system in Dark Souls. It happened pretty infrequently throughout the PvE experience in Dark Souls, which I think is like good because it's already a difficult and punishing game. And so I think if it happened frequently, it would be an issue, which gets into a little bit of my criticisms of the PvP. I just fundamentally think the system like doesn't really work. First of all, as soon as I unlocked it, I got immediately invaded. Like every single time, it didn't matter what time of day I started, instant invade within 30 seconds. And that basically meant that like I had to engage with the PvP system immediately, and or just turn it off if I wanted like my pacing to be fixed. And what happens is that there is a progression curve to both the PvE systems and the PvP system, which means that as soon as I had unlocked it, I had access to nothing. I had no progression, and I was versus people who are deep into the progression system and who were actively just way stronger than me, who knew the maps stronger, like more well than me, and I just got crushed. Like literally my experience was I wanted to give it, you know, I was stubborn, I wanted to give it a shot. Like booting up like 3 or 4 different loops, getting completely demolished at all of them, and then I ended up switching to PvP out of tilt because I was like, all right, well the character in the PvP side must be super powerful. to only learn that there's a leveling system on the PvP side. The more people you kill in the PvP system by invading them, the more unlocks you get to make your character stronger. So now I was really weak on the PvP side, going into PvE worlds where the player character works really deep into their progression system, and then I would get rolled. So the whole system was just super jank. Like, it's just one of those things that, I don't know, there probably isn't enough of a player base to really create matchmaking balance in that way. But honestly, all that aside, the other main problem is that I just had really bad desync. I'll see if I can throw in some clips here, but players teleporting around, bullets feeling like they're not registering, like all of that stuff was like more frequent than infrequent in terms of my experience of trying to PvP. And it literally led to the meta of just being like, pull out your machete and just run full speed at the enemy and hope you one-shot them before they one-shot you, because the machete is a one-hit kill in most cases. And so it was literally just a match to see like who could machete the other person just by running at them. So all of the, like, you know, Assassin's Creed style, if you've ever seen the Assassin's Creed multiplayer, I have a soft spot for that, of like hiding in the crowd, and there's like none of that, because theoretically you could like try to, you know, catch the player off guard and give them an edge, but the tools are there, but there's no incentive to do that, like in terms of like the player experience, or like just try to do like a straight firefight, because most of your, even if you feel like you're hitting them, you're missing shots, and so it's literally just run at each other with the machete, which is like kind of cringe. So yeah, that's PvP in a nutshell. Not great. I wouldn't recommend that one for people, but I'm also not, you know, not the reason I've got the game. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is the actual story itself, which I think is unfortunately one of the weaker parts of the game. This is a very, very minor spoiler warning. Like, they literally show this as the main selling point of the game and like establish like why this game is interesting in the trailers. But in case you want to go in completely blind, here it is. Just skip over the story section. The goal of the game is to assassinate 7 different targets. And so the way the story is presented is it's like, cool, introduction to the main character. Here are the 7 villains of the story. Go at it, go forth into this world. And the way that they allow you to do that mechanically is that you can either select an individual target or story to follow, and it'll be like, okay, go to location A at noon to learn more about their story. And it's like a very linear in that sense. The problem is that when you're visiting that location at that time of day, there's a bunch of other shit happening in the world. And so it's one of those things where it's like, naturally the player wants to like, you know, read everything or be like, oh cool, like what's this? Like, oh, there's some other event happening, right? Like, you don't want to just narrowly focus on one thing at the exclusion of everything else. Like, you can, and the game gives you that option, but like, it is the player's natural tendency to want to explore and like see what else is going on the level. And the problem that creates is basically it's just so hard to keep track of every piece of information, because what this leads to is that you'll be like going into one level, be like, I want to find more about this villain, this target who I have to assassinate, and in doing so you'll get like 4 different side quests and like maybe a partial piece of information for another main villain who connects to another part of the day, and it's just total information overload. So I think that's the main problem, and why like the mid game is potentially weak, not only mechanically but narratively, because it's just one of those things that the player just can't really keep track. And the game tries really hard to basically catalog and organize and record every piece of information you find in the UI itself, and you can go back and read and be like, oh yeah, what was the relevant information here? So the game isn't actually painful to play in that part, but it's just one of those things that because it's so complex, and the way that it's presented, like the concurrency of all of the storylines, it's just one of those things that is just super hard to get engaged, because anytime you're like, all right, cool, this character's kind of interesting, it's like, all right, well, I've just learned 3 other things that seemed like they could be interesting, and I don't know what the most relevant pieces of that are about 3 other characters that you like were not there to learn about. And so it's just super difficult to keep all of that in mind. The other piece of it that I will throw out there that is personally something that I don't like, so feel free to make your own opinions about this, is that a lot of the way that the narrative presented is also reliant on written logs and audio logs. You know, very like BioShock style, you know, level design, sort of like world building. And if you're like me, like I just don't have the patience or care that much to like read a book in a game, you know what I mean, or like listen to a podcast in a game. So it's just one of those things that like a lot of that stuff goes sort of in one ear out the other for me. It's hard. It's a hard stop to the actual mechanical pacing of the game in a way that it's just hard for me to like really care. I much prefer like it being either, you know, happening around me and I'm able to like mechanically engage with it, or even a cutscene. And to be honest, I don't like cutscenes, but at least they just sort of like provide the player like the story is told out at them. They don't have to necessarily like go out of their way to like really try to keep all this information in mind or like parse out what the most relevant piece of it is, because in a text, for example, there'll be like a lot of just miscellaneous like red herring type information. So I think the story is probably weak for that part of it. The actual main story around the main character I think is like fine. It like I don't have a problem even with the ending as well, but it's just one of those things where the vast majority of the story, like 85%, I would say, is told through audio and written logs, which is just like it just didn't work for me, and especially since it's just so non-linear in how it's told, because there's so much concurrent information. Which brings me to the level design. So the level design I think is interesting because I haven't seen it done this way in a roguelike specifically that much. Like I think the closest parallel I can make is actually Prey Mooncrash, which is another roguelite by Arcane Studios, although apparently it's a separate part of the company, according to NoClip's docuseries interviews. If you're interested, by the way, I'll provide a link. But anyway, there's essentially 4 levels to the game, so 4 unique spaces. But the way that the roguelike or randomization or replayability is offered is that there's 4 different states for each level, and those states being time of day, so there's morning, noon, evening, and night. And the levels change, I would say, mostly dramatically. Like the overall foundation of the level is the same, but certain areas will be locked off, other areas will open up. Different areas will be the focus of the time of day. So in the noon, it'll maybe be like some town center. And in the evening, maybe it'll be like this, back alley area where there's like more relevant, interesting stuff happening. Or areas will get recontextualized. Different villains, different targets will inhabit the areas at different times of day. And I'd say it works okay. It's one of those things where the replayable levels allow you to gain certain mastery over navigating them while still keeping it fresh, but at the same time, it's not really fresh enough that it keeps me super engaged. Like if you're familiar with another big roguelike that came out recently, Hades, it only technically had 4 levels, and the way that it made it super replayable was through the different randomization. And the way that Deathloop does it is certainly not randomized. Every single day and level combination is handcrafted, which the plus side is that it allows you to do really interesting like narrative or side quest stuff, where it's like if you poke a button in the morning, it'll change something that happens in the evening, and that continuity I think is pretty interesting, and I don't know how much that's been done before. But the problem is this just feels like, I don't know, it just kind of gets old fast, and it's hard to like understand what's relevant because there's so many little secrets and like small stories that I feel like you have to be so intentionally focused on how they play out to be able to get the most of them. So a lot of this, I'm sort of speaking vaguely because I don't want to do any spoilers, right? But a lot of this is what I discovered in the post game, where it's like I sort of casually collected a bunch of like loose threads over the course of the main game, but didn't really understand how to focus on them and couldn't really passively absorb the like relevancy of them or like why they were interesting until I like took out the time and be like, I'm gonna ignore everything else. I'm going to do this thing in the morning, go there at noon, go back there in the evening, and then finish up at night and see the full throughput of like how this changes to like, that was the only way that you could really see those like loose threads through and like get closure to whatever that weird thing was. And the game has a lot of these where it's like just during like the actual regular playthrough until I did the post game, like the vast majority of them is just something that you just sort of like happens to you, and you get to see it's it's just one of those things that you get to see like 1/4 of it at any given time, and occasionally you'll see like half of these like subplots, and it's just hard to follow. And I think it'd be like, the problem is I just don't know how you fix it, because it's like I appreciate that those things exist, but it just wasn't done in a way where it was easy for the player to engage with them unless they were all in. But doing like 10 different loose threads in a row means that you're replaying like the 4 levels like way more than I think they were really designed to be. So I just don't think it works well. I will say the other interesting thing about the level design is that there's a lot of cool verticality. A lot of 2, 3, 4 story buildings, and a lot of them you can sort of hop through windows and stuff like that. Very Dishonored-esque, and I really like that about, I like verticality. I think that stuff adds a lot of depth to the levels. It makes them more compact as well, which I think is important. And I did like the loose threads. Like the post game was one of the most enjoyable times because of the actual like attention to detail that they made in trying to build out the world and like add these sort of loose threads to be able to like see all the way through. But the problem is I just think the vast majority of players aren't going to get to see them, and they're just really not compelling during the mid game because you're so focused on the actual like main plot line that's happening and like how that sort of how those experiences change over the course of the levels. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings on the level design. There's some really good stuff, but it's just like so heavily caveated, you know what I mean? The other thing that I want to throw out there about the level design real quick as well is that one of the things that I think makes the levels feel stale is the player's agency over the world. I talked about this a little bit, but like sometimes there's things you can do in the morning that'll affect what happens at night. But those like feel so, I don't know, on/off switch, you know what I mean? It's like just different states, sort of like there's not a lot of nuance or complexity there. And I think part of the problem is that it just leaves me feeling like the player just doesn't have a lot of agency over the world. Like even when you do these like assassinations and stuff, like, okay, yeah, if you kill someone in the morning, they're not going to be there in the evening, but like it doesn't really impact the world, I think, in the way that like feels super meaningful. And I think the main reason why that is at the end of the day, everything just resets when the full loop is complete. Once you get through the 4 different stages of the day, you're just back to zero. You've functionally made no progress except for anything that you've collected like information wise or mechanically through the infusion system. And so it's just one of those things that ultimately it feels like unsatisfying, I think, to exert agency over the world, because it just feels kind of hollow. Like I think if there was like 2 different layers to the game where it was like, okay, cool, you're able to change something in the morning and then it affects the evening, but like if you reach like a major narrative point halfway through the game, it affects all of the layers or something like that. Or like maybe if they removed like the evening and was just like it's like morning, noon, and night, and then did that to like change the content, like I just think that would have been more effective, because at the end of the day it's like when you beat the game you feel about the same as where you left off of when you started it, which is probably not a good thing. Like, yeah, you know the story, you figured it out, and you technically got an ending, but it's just one of those things that it's like, the world just kind of was the way that it is, and I just didn't feel like I had a huge impact on it, which is a shame. And I think it's a combination of the way that the story is told, as well as the level design being able to reflect that. Alrighty, so the next section that I want to cover is the systems, because I mentioned this in the game overview, but this game is very systems heavy, which is particularly why the tutorial is so rough. So there's powers, guns, perks, gun modifications, and the infusion system. And that's basically all of the like mechanical / UI systems. There's also the narrative systems as well, of like the mechanics of actually tracking a quest. I'm going to largely not talk about that though, because it's sort of, I think, pretty self-explanatory. You just track quests in your like quest log. And B, it's sort of more narratively focused, so I want to get it away from spoilers. But at least in terms of the actual systems, I feel torn on them. I think the summation or walk away experience of how I would like talk about them is that it just feels like a Destiny 2 or gacha game, almost like weird collection of just crap, which is not a good description. Which is to say that basically you can collect powers, you can collect upgrades for your powers, you can collect guns, you can collect perks, and there's randomized aspects to them. So for example, for the perks and gun modifiers, there's like gray quality or poor. It's like, I don't know, green, I forget the specific colors, blue and purple, and it's sort of like, oh, you got like an epic perk, which is like a better version of the previous perk. But the problem is, like, I feel like you just eventually find your favorites and the rest becomes junk. And on top of this, you can get duplicates of the same thing. So it's one of those things where it's like, it just feels like most of the items you get are actually just straight up vendor trash. Which, like, theoretically, you could find multiple playstyles and find perks to play around with, like, oh, well, maybe this is more of a stealth build, and hey, maybe this is more of like a fighting build. But I ended up just trying to get like a good hybrid of like combat and movement style perks and gun modifications and guns, and then it's just like I just left it at that. And once you get an epic version of a gun that you like there's really no reason to really change it. there's only like one or two silenced weapons in the entire game, so it's like, all right, you get the best quality silenced weapon, and then you just always carry that, and then the rest is just whatever, other guns that you prefer. And so I just think it ultimately feels unrewarding to collect a lot of this stuff, which is exasperated by the fact that like it feels like you're just super useless without a lot of the good stuff, right? Which I talked about earlier. Just leads to like a super unsatisfying and like time-consuming system, because the whole to talk about like how it all ties together, right? The infusion system is basically the currency in the game that allows you to keep things permanently, right? Across different loops, across different times of day, all that stuff. And so basically what you can do is like collect infusion in the world, or just break down the random crap in your inventory to turn it into the infusion currency, of which you spend on keeping the weapons. And once you have a weapon, you have it permanently. Once you have a perk, you have it permanently. Once you have a power, you have it permanently, as long as you infuse it. It's like explained really complexly in the tutorial, which I actually didn't get it until like halfway through the game, of like how it functioned. But it's like really simple. It's just, you just spend currency, everything turns into currency if you want it to, and then it'll just stay forever. And if you don't infuse it, then it's just gone at the end of the day. Like, it's a really simple system, but it's just one of those things that it's just like, I feel like, I mean, personally, I dislike any system that has clutter, because it just means like you're like scrolling through like 3 different duplicates of like 20, 25, 30 different versions of like perks that like most of them are like, all right, you move slightly faster, you can reload faster, your accuracy is better, right? It's like ultimately unsatisfying. The powers are, I think, the most interesting because they actually change your playstyle. The powers and the guns, right? Whether you have like a mid-range, long-range weapon, or whether you have like more stealth-focused or combat-focused powers, as well as the actual upgrades for the powers themselves. And so I think those are fine, but it's just one of those things where it's like, I don't know, it just, the randomization aspect of it just feels super unsatisfying because of all the clutter. So I think all of that like complexity in the actual systems design itself really hurts the tutorial part of the game, really hurts the onboarding. And at the end of the day, it's like needlessly complex, because like the player, I assume, is just 9 times out of 10 gonna find like their favorite thing, use it, and then just fucking ignore the system. And that's 100% what happened with me. I just ignored 90% of the systems because I was like, this is just a bunch of clutter and it's just wasting my time. Again, like a pretty weak part of the game, I would say. Just touching on the powers specifically a little bit more, because I realized I haven't talked a ton about them. I do think the powers are cool. Like, I think there's not that many. There's like 6, and they all feel really distinct. However, I will say that the shift ability should be, they should just give that. It's the same ability in the Dishonored, the short range teleport ability. And it's just like, I just don't think it's an option for players to not have it. It just feels so fundamental to the game design and like the actual like game feel. I just can't imagine players ever running without it, or at most running without it for like one specific objective or achievement, and then immediately going back to it. So I almost wish they just made that like the staple ability that the player had at all times, because it just feels so bad to play without it. But I think the rest of the powers are cool without getting into too much detail. I think there's good variety, and there's not a million of them, so it doesn't get overcomplicated. It's mostly the perks and gun modifications and a little bit of the guns themselves that just feel overloaded with vendor trash. Alrighty, which brings us to the actual combat itself. So this is, I think, I mean, I've been basically really critical of the game up until this point. I think I've been trying to be fair and show where it works and like where, it comes together. But I think the combat is the best example of like where it can really come together, and the main reason why the game is actually like worth talking about. Because at the end of the game, when you have the things that you need in order to be good at the game, in order to feel powerful, in order to feel like you have agency over the systems, the actual combat is so fucking fun. It is great to like fly through the world at max speed. There's essentially 2 functionally different like ways to play the game. You can play it in stealth, and you can play it, I'll steal this from Dishonored, but chaotically, which is essentially just playing it like an FPS with like extra steps or with powers. And the FPS gameplay is actually so much fun. And this is the same sort of problem I had in the Dishonored series, which is that doing it the stealth route is really tough. You have to have a lot of patience because the pacing is so slow. The difference here, and I think this is where Deathloop shines over Dishonored, is that if everything breaks into chaos, if you get spotted, the combat is fine. Like, it feels supernatural to be able to run away without being like super punishing. There's no like bonus points if you do like a ghost style run, or if you just want to try to shoot it out, and then even if you die, like, it's still pretty forgiving, because it's sort of like, it's a looping game. So death doesn't really matter. And I think all of that, like the forgiving systems, the fact that it's not punishing if you screw up, make the gameplay way more enjoyable. And I think the problem is that the the actual combat is way more fun than the stealth systems. Like, once I got to the end game and like I was overpowered, I mean, obviously I was overpowered, so I didn't actually have to stealth, but like that's what I mean, right? Like, I didn't feel like I wanted to stealth ever. It was just like I wanted to play the game when it was at its peak fun, and that's running around, being reckless, like intertwining a little bit stealth here and there when like to sort of even up the odds, using some powers to give me an advantage in like big packs of enemies and stuff like that. But I feel like that's just how the game was meant to be played. And the problem is you just can't access that until like 80% of the way through the game, right? When you have the powers to be able to give you the agency to do that, when you have the epic guns, when you have the things that double your health pool, because like that's how, you know, crazy different some of these passives are. And it's just like yeah, like I said, it's Mirror's Edge with guns, basically. Which is like, I don't know, if that doesn't sound fun to you, like I don't know how to sell it anymore. It's just, the game feels great, the guns feel great, the reloading animations are super meaty, the sound design of the weapons is also fantastic. Being able to shift around, just leap distance, like great distances, while sprinting and sliding and peeking around corners. It just gives you so much fluidity in the controls, and like how to just run around the world. Like that should be what I think they double down on the game more. I think they should have focused more on like how to give the player more of that. And it's the reason why I spent so many hours on the post game. It's not because like of the narrative being like, oh man, I really want to see this one side detail of the story. It was just because mechanically I was like, yeah, I just give me stuff to do and I'll just run around the world and do it. And I really think that means that if this game has DLC, it's actually going to be like potentially really good, assuming that you have all of the stuff that like, you know, you have at the end of the game. So yeah, I mean, I think if anyone's played Dishonored, like none of this will be new. Presumably, you know, you have an opinion already around whether you like the stealth systems of Dishonored versus the combat, but I always felt that the stealth systems, and particularly the punishing aspects of Dishonored, made it like actively dissuade the players from trying to engage with the chaos combat systems. But I think the chaos combat systems were always the fun part. And I will say, at the end of the game, like Deathloop has the best version of that. I think arguably the best version, where it just feels like you're really unleashed and the game's like, go at it, man, have fun. And I just wish more of the game was like that. To dive into a little specific like subtangent here on the actual combat itself is the assassination objectives. They're sort of like, I don't know, these mini segments where you have to like learn a villain's weakness, or like draw them out, find a way to draw them out into the open, and it just becomes repetitive. Like, it's cool to do once or twice to like be like, ah yes, this time I drew him out this way, or this time I drew him out that way. But I just don't think they're rewarding to do multiple times. I don't know how you necessarily make that more interesting, because I mean, it's literally like I said, if you play Dishonored, it's very similar to that. But Dishonored isn't necessarily meant to be played like 4 or 5 times, whereas like these guys, you'll assassinate like upwards of like 10 times over the course of how long you play. So it's just one of those things that it's like, you know, it's, I don't know. And they do it a little bit, like they're depending on if they're, you know, in their noon location versus their evening location, right? That changes it up a little bit. But I do think that's another criticism that I wasn't sure where to throw in, so I decided to add it in the combat section. Which lastly brings us to the technical aspects, and I just don't have a lot of great things to say here. Prior to this point, I would have given the game like a recommendation if you're interested in the sales pitch, but like with all of the nuance, like a smaller amount of nuance, because video's fucking 30 minutes at this point. But you know, being like, hey, if you played Dishonored and you like, you know, the combat, if the idea of the like looping sounds interesting to you, if you are okay with the way that the narrative is told through audio logs and written logs, if you're fine to be able to comb the world and you don't mind like having to retrace your steps in order to like follow these different loose threads, like if that sounds, if like in the way that the positive way I would reframe that last bit is like being like the loose threads are really interesting, and to see how things change over the course of the day, and like there's a lot of nuance and care put into the level design. If like those things interest you, then like this game could be for you. But, and this is the huge sort of like just ugly stain on this game, is I just had really bad memory leaks, and I can't remember the last game that I played that had memory leaks this bad. I had my game crash upwards of like 10 to 15 times. I tried Googling to figure out like what was causing the issue. I had my drivers updated. I tried messing around with the individual settings, playing on like high and then medium and then low. And the only thing that could fix it, the only thing, was turning every graphical setting to the absolute minimum, which sucks. Like, it didn't even look that bad, to be honest. Like, I actually thought the game looked fine, but I basically got halfway through the game and was like, I just have to play in the lowest setting, because anything else, and in less than an hour, my game would just straight up crash because of just a really bad memory leak. So the game would progressively lag, and then I would just error out. So, I mean, hopefully they're able to identify it, since that was the only problem that I had. But the problem was so bad that I can't actually recommend the game in good conscience, given the severity of the issue. It was probably the worst technical problem that I've had in a game in recent memory. The only things that I would really say are worse is like if it was literally unplayable, like it didn't start up, or like had 0 FPS and there's no way to fix it, or like a memory save corruption. But outside of that, like, these crashes happened all of the time. It was really bad. So it sucks, but you know, it is what it is. Hopefully they fix it. But yeah, outside of that sour note, that is Deathloop. So definitely a mixed bag. It sucks because I really think there's like a gem hidden here where, like, if they focused more on the like Mirror's Edge with guns side of the game, like, this could have been amazing. And I don't even necessarily think the roguelike direction was bad either. Like, I actually really enjoyed Prey Mooncrash, but I would actually say that Prey Mooncrash was more interesting. I think it used the mechanics of the narrative roguelike thing just in a more compelling way. And they had, like, the way they did it was like it was a class-based system as opposed to just being like the character. But I just think they went too complex on the system design. I think they should have like really simplified it and tried to focus on the core fun aspects of it. I think the gunplay was great, and so it's like they don't have to change much there. I think the powers were fine. I wouldn't change much there other than make the shift a staple ability. But I think the story would need like a serious another go around. I think the level design was also fine. I wouldn't change too much there either, other than just for the player being able to enact more agency over it. But yeah, I think they really need to do another pass on the story itself, complexity of the systems, and just try to get the player to the fun part of the game way faster. Like, start them at that level and then find a way to make it more fun from that point, as opposed to basically be like, here's the game, it could be fun, you know, at the end if you're into that, and then for the half or the majority of the game being like, yeah, but you don't have access to most of the things that would actually make it super enjoyable. So it's just a shame. It's just a shame, you know? But anyways, yeah, that's Deathloop. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter or in the comments or whatever. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.